I'm a member of the steering committee. And it's my honor to introduce Tim Byrnes, who, for those who don't know, is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Political Science and the Chair of Political Science at Colgate University. He has a BA from Le Moyne College, a PhD from Cornell, and he specializes in transnational politics, religion and politics, comparative politics, and American politics. And I think is very well known in this community as one of the panelists on the Ivory Tower on WCNY. So with that, welcome, Tim.
Is there a chance to turn that off? It's in my eye.
Oh, yeah.
Move your podium on.
This function is not.
Technology's great when it works.
I'll do this okay. Thank you, Bruce. When he was introducing me, I noted that I'm an expert in transnational politics and religion and politics, and not in Trump. And so I get invited to, it's Claudia Tenney in the back. Good to see you and Claudia back friends again. Yeah. As a local pundit, I get invited quite often to speak to community groups, and that's sort of my ticket to expertise, is that I go on TV on Friday night and say whatever happens to cross my synapses at the time. Actually, Friday morning. But here I feel a little nervous and intimidated because you're all profoundly informed, engaged, actively resisting the current administration and its policies. So what can I add to that would be valuable to you? So I thought what I would do is I'll say a few things that I hope will maybe spark conversation here tonight and in the future. And then I plan on making one or two comments about the systemic nature of the problems that we face, because they go well beyond Donald J. Trump, and they have been simmering, I have been arguing on Friday nights, under the surface of American politics for a very long time. The question before us is, how bad are things? Bruce asked me if I wanted a title, and I said, Breaking or Bending, American Democracy 1 year into Trump. Yeah, I happen to be talking to my daughter Bridget, who just came back from a year in Australia. That was her response to the Trump election, which seemed quite rational. She's now back in Portland, Oregon. I told her I was doing this tonight, and she said, what's the title? And I said, Bending or Breaking? And she said, oh, it's breaking. So that's one sort of view. That was represented in a very interesting article in the New York Review of Books, an issue and a half ago, by James Mann, where, and the title of it was Damage Bigly. And Mann's argument was that this has been an absolute disaster for American politics, policy, and democracy. And he listed all of the usual areas of concern, particularly not so much the legislative acts that have been passed in the Trump era, but the presidential and administrative movement against migrants in particular, the disastrous retreat on certain American foreign policy actions, the blunt and open racism both in the government and on Fox News, the sort of degradation of discourse and democratic norms. Then you pick up New York Magazine and Andrew Sullivan, who's currently in a lot of deserved hot water for saying that the Me Too movement is overstated, but that's another argument. Andrew Sullivan basically said in New York Magazine, you know, it could be a lot worse. He hasn't called out the troops. He hasn't suspended the Constitution. Many of the institutions that check and balance the American presidency are holding, and we're still the democratic United States we were a year ago. I'd like to just quickly separate us into two kind of buckets of concern. One is policy, And it is of no surprise to me at all that Donald Trump has conducted himself in public policy exactly how one would expect a Republican plutocrat to conduct himself. The talk about populism and the forgotten man and woman I knew was a complete lie during the campaign. As I like to tell people, I'm a New Yorker. I've known Donald Trump for 4 years. Donald Trump is a lying monster. Has been for his entire life. I was going to say adult life, but apparently he was beating up his teachers when he was in the 3rd grade. He's a monster, in my estimation. So I didn't believe anything he said during the campaign, and I expected the Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryans of the world, who are slightly less monstrous in my view, but are willing to violate American political and constitutional norms to advance their plutocratic interests. And that's what you see going on in areas like the tax bill, etc. This is what the Republican Party, which I'll return to in a moment, wants. Donald Trump is giving it to them. He has, in a sense, outsourced domestic policy to the congressional leadership. And so I'm, as a, I hope, progressive thinking person, outraged at what I see happening in my government. The Electoral College did its dastardly deed. And so this is what I expected, and it is what to be expected when you allow the Electoral College to endure, when it repeatedly elects minority Republican presidents, and they then go against decades of American progressive consensus and policy. It's what you get. So I don't like it, but it's what you get. What concerns me is obviously the autocratic threat posed by Donald Trump and people like Stephen Miller and Jeff Sessions. And that's what I think we really need to, in organizations like yours, be attendant to. And what I'd like to do is to just go through the institutions that Donald Trump has targeted and to give you my assessment as an interested citizen and lowly pundit about how successful he has been, and then to make some concluding remarks about the nature of the Republican Party and the American presidency. What autocrats do, anyone who studies comparative politics knows, is that they attack independent institutions. That is what they do. It is the defining nature of autocracy, is to look out at the society, the government, and the cultural institutions of a society, decide which ones might be able to serve as countervailing institutions to the power of the executive, and then to attack them, to try to delegitimize them, and to remove them as potential blocks to the advancing power of the autocrat and his regime. This has been going on for thousands of years. This is how it works. And the United States has long prided itself on a multiplicity of intervening institutions. The Constitution presents some. We have a vibrant and thriving civil society. We have a free media. We have long presented ourselves in comparative politics in the academy and in world community as a society that has so many countervailing institutions that it is impossible for any one institution, particularly the executive, to be able to advance its interests without being constrained. And this is what Donald Trump understands. He's good at two things. Not completely squandering his father's money. Right? He has done that. This idea that he's created a successful company is complete balderdash, but he has not squandered all of his father's money, and he has this kind of sixth sense for autocratic discourse. He knows without being told by anyone, I think, because it's interesting, there aren't really sort of, there's no H.R. Haldeman behind the curtain. There isn't Karl Rove as the president's brain. This is Donald Trump knows how to do this. One thing, which is to spot institutional players in the society that might be able to constrain the advancement of his own troubled personality and to attack them. The first is the media, of course. And this is a kind of an Orwellian trick that he has played by taking the phrase fake news, which was applied to the kind of things that were being advanced by his supporters and Russian hackers and others, and turning that on anything that he doesn't like. So fake news was a word that was used against him and he just decided that he was going to change its meaning and apply it to the free press. It reminds me of that moment in one of the debates where Hillary Clinton said that he was a puppet of Putin. And Trump said, I'm not the puppet, you're the puppet. That has absolutely no meaning in the English language. It is literally devoid of meaning. But he just says it. And his supporters, of course, don't believe it, they adopt it. And so I look at the media, the televised media, which I have to admit I don't watch. And I'm not an anti-television snob. You want to talk about The Bachelor? I'll meet you afterwards. I'm not a snob, but I don't watch televised news. I think it's an effort to misinform the public. That is its purpose. But I do read a lot of newspapers, and I see the Washington Post and the New York Times in what I think is a relatively healthy competition in order to be the sort of fourth estate against the Trump regime. I've been relatively disappointed in the New York Times recently. Something is going on there. I can't quite get my fingers around it, but some kind of effort to be fair is happening in the New York Times. And this is not a time for the New York Times to be fair. This is a time for the New York Times to call things what they are and to define words in clear terms. The Washington Post, I believe right now, is an absolutely fabulous journalistic outlet, which is every day, not only in its printed edition, but if you go to the WashingtonPost.com, this is updated every 10 and 15 minutes. This is what's happening. This is the outrage. This is what has to be done to stop it. So I think he has thus far been not successful at destroying the print news, but he has an advantage that no other autocrat in US history, or ostensible autocrat, or hoped for autocrat has, and that is a state propaganda network. And I don't watch it, but I read about it in the Washington Post and online, and what's happening at Fox News in the evening is deeply, deeply disturbing. We'll get to the conspiracy theories in a moment, but I just saw someone tweet the other day. I also learn a lot on Twitter. I saw someone tweet the other day, where is the board of the News Corp? I don't expect Rupert Murdoch to be a person of integrity. But what's going on in the Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson corner of our American media is deeply, deeply troubling. It's state propaganda at its most base level. And so Trump has a certain segment of the population that isn't reading the Washington Post, that isn't reading the New York Times. It's not reading anything. It's watching Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, who are telling them that the FBI is involved in a violent conspiracy to overturn the election. Second is an independent judiciary. And we all know that Trump has a habit of undermining the independent judiciary by saying that they're Mexicans or they're against him or whatever it is that he says. But this is not unique to Trump. We have developed a politicized judiciary in the United States that is highly problematic, in my view. If you're going to have judicial review, you can't have the Constitution simply mean what a political party says it means if they happen to have 5 votes on the Supreme Court. This drives me crazy, actually. And he's a sort of the nth degree of that, right? Anything that's against me is an undermining of right-thinking, democratic values, etc. But what's more troubling to me is that he's actually appointing a lot of judges. And this we get back to the real villain in the piece, which is Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell undermines senatorial norms in 2 ways. He refused to consider Garland's nomination, but he also he held up dozens, perhaps hundreds of lower court appointees. And now not only is he pushing those through, but he is not allowing home state senators to prevent these district court appointments, which have been going on in the United States for 100 years through the so-called blue slip. And we won't go into that in detail. But McConnell is reshaping the American judiciary for a long time to come. And I would hope that these judicial officers would be defenders of the Constitution and be willing to stand up to the autocratic tendencies of the Republican Party and Donald Trump. But I am not heartened by the kind of people who are being appointed to these offices or by the outrage that is Neil Gorsuch. Neil Gorsuch is a partisan Republican operative in judges' robes. If you actually look at this guy's social agenda, it is shocking. He gives speeches at paid events at the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. How can that be okay? He attends dinner parties at John Cornyn's house with Mitch McConnell's wife. Look, I'm not naive. Abe Fortas was Lyndon Johnson's favorite drinking buddy, okay? I understand, but we have an expectation that members of the court would not simply be political operatives of a particular administration. So I'm concerned about the judiciary. The other is the permanent government, or the bureaucracy, or the deep state. This is like, this is a terrible thing. Well, there is a permanent government, and it does not belong to Donald Trump. I remember when a guy named Buddy Corellis became president of Colgate, and I was asked what I thought of him. And I said, well, here's what I think of him. I think he misunderstands things. I don't have anything to hold, my phone. He thinks that this is Colgate University and I've just handed it to him. That's not how it works. It's not his Colgate University. It's a complex, multifaceted institution with alumni, tenured faculty, students who are mostly transients and not to be taken too seriously. But it's a complex, multifaceted institution that has a long-term life and integrity. And the American national government is not something that's handed to a president. We'll get back to this in a minute. And do with it as you will. There are laws which were passed before the president got there that he is constitutionally has to enforce. There are long-term American interests around the world and domestically that the president is expected to uphold as a constitutional officer. And Donald Trump, with a kind of an unerring, savant weirdness, knows just where to go to say that this is illegitimate because they are not advancing my interest. Partly this has happened because anyone with integrity, not anyone, but many people with integrity, particularly in the State Department, are getting the heck out. People are going to leave the Justice Department. But we see this in its most dangerous form in this idea that the FBI is a hotbed of left-wing opposition to American interests that are trying to overturn an election by destroying a presidency. I mean, it's just so crazy as to be beyond belief if you didn't see Devin Nunes actually saying it every day. The FBI, a left-wing conspiracy. I mean, seriously. This is an effort to undermine and delegitimize not just an independent Justice Department, but any notion of law enforcement that is not designed to advance the interests of the executive power. And I see some of you who know a lot more, I'm looking here, who know a lot more about how these kind of systems work than I do. That ain't good, right? So the idea that the mayor of Hamilton could say, the police force of Hamilton only does what I want them to do. And if they are investigating any crimes that I don't want them to investigate, that means that they are a conspiracy out to get me and we have to get rid of them. I mean, you can take it down to the local level. It's really quite astounding how much they are getting away with this bizarre claim. And not only is Trump doing it, but people like Ron Johnson, a senator from the state of Wisconsin, say that there's a secret society in the FBI. I mean, have you ever met an FBI agent? The idea that this is some sort of, Berkeley cabal that's out to get conservatism, it's just beyond belief. And yet it's being purveyed on state propaganda television. Leaders of the Republican Party within Congress are saying it every day. Paul Ryan is guilty of allowing Devin Nunes to continue this nonsense. So, the media, it's still there. The judiciary, it's still there. We'll see. I'm worried. The bureaucracy, permanent government, is being undermined in a very aggressive way. And I just want to say, because this is about me, the other independent institution that autocrats always go against? Universities. They're coming for us. They're absolutely coming for us. The idea that they're just going to allow free inquiry and research and social science and cultural arts to carry on without their police power being applied against it just seems profoundly naive. So, breaking, I wouldn't say. Bending, pretty hard. And the problem is that the Republican Party has capitulated entirely. And I have to say that I'm a pretty naive guy. I never thought that it would go this fast, this totally. They're gone. They're gone. The Democratic Party has all the institutional weaknesses of a minority party in our political system, and we don't have time to go into it, but we saw this last week, right? I mean, I'm not here to defend Chuck Schumer, believe me. Well, what's he supposed to do? But the Republican Party has completely capitulated. And the only ones who haven't have sort of, you know. Jeff Flake gives this, he gives a speech comparing Trump to Stalin. The same day he votes to give Stalin unwarranted surveillance powers over the American public. What are we talking about, Jeff? So I'm very concerned that the Republican Party has institutionally linked itself to this form of executive power. But here's just what I want to say in closing. It's not all about Trump. The Republican Party was headed this way for a long time. And this is a very partisan view, and I'm open to argument, probably not for most of you, that I've overstated it. But what happened in the Florida recount in 2000 was not good. One side said, let's count, and the other side went and hired, college Republicans to bang on the glass. The sort of notion that was put forward by the Republican Party in 2000 that the only way this is legitimate is if we win. The Mitch McConnell destruction of the United States Senate by the creation of the permanent partisan filibuster, which is not how filibusters have worked across American history. The idea that nothing would get passed in the United States Senate, virtually nothing, unless there were 60 votes. The holding up of the Garland nomination, and not only holding up Garland, but others, people like Rand Paul and Ted Cruz saying, we are not going to confirm anybody appointed by this president. Their complicity with birtherism, their refusal to speak out against it in many ways that would actually have undermined it. And the sort of Paul Ryan imperviousness to economic evidence that the political program that he's been backing for so many years is simply not backed up by any historical evidence whatsoever. Not even to mention, although I'm mentioning it, the denial of climate change. So, I mean, what was that? Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein wrote that book that, we're not polarized. One party just went crazy. They really sort of went off the beam there over the last 20 years. And what you get when you go off the beam is Donald Trump. But you also get Donald Trump if you aggrandize the American presidency well beyond anything ever imagined by the framers of the Constitution. And for this is a bipartisan responsibility. Indeed, this was largely invented by the Democratic Party. Franklin Roosevelt, the creation of the administrative state during the New Deal. Harry Truman's bizarre notion in June of 1950 that he could fight a war in Korea without asking anybody whether he could or not. John Kennedy with his finger sort of hovering over the nuclear button during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Barack Obama explicitly articulating that in his power as President of the United States to extrajudicially execute American citizens abroad without any oversight whatsoever. This is an aggrandizement of the presidential office. And I used to say to students on TV and anyone who would listen, look, you can't say that an aggrandized president is good if you've got the presidency, because you're not going to have it for very long. I never imagined, because I'm naive, that it would actually be Trump, but I knew it would be somebody. If you want Lyndon Johnson to have that much power, then you want Richard Nixon to have that much power. if you want Bill Clinton to have that much power, then you want George Bush to have that much power. And every president since Roosevelt, really, although there have been slight variations as we've moved along. I actually liked George H.W. Bush's response when they asked him what he was going to do in his second term. And he said, I'll handle things as they come up. It reminded me of my first political hero, Jerry Brown, Governor Moonbeam, now in his fourth term, who said in 1976, when I voted for him in the New York primary, I'm not going to do much because I think the president has too much power. That's just long since gone. And we see now that a presidentialized political system leads, when you have unprincipled people in congressional leadership, that they think that it is their role to support what the president wants. Not just in policy, because what the president wants is what they want, but in terms of norms, practices, constitutional actions. That the Paul Ryans and the Mitch McConnells of the world are saying, well, he's our leader. Orrin Hatch, you could spend all night talking about him, he said this really weird thing. He said, well, he said that Trump was going to be the best president ever, which is weird. But he said, I have served under 6 presidents. What does that mean? Served under. This is a co-equal branch of government. This is Article 1 of the Constitution. The idea that the president ought to be leading Congress, not only in policy terms, but in constitutional norm, and this is just, for my money, by the way, I've been saying this for a long time, this is not the Constitution that was ratified by the framers in 1789. This is a presidentialized government, which when placed in the hands of a monster, poses an absolute dire threat to American democracy. Feel better? The agenda says there's a few minutes for questions.
Yes.
Yes.
I find it bizarre that there's certain things that you find hard to understand. I lived through COINTELPRO, and then the FBI was controlled by somebody who was nuts and was on the other side. And we never did find out what was going on. I'm convinced that where the government of the United States, the big mistake that we're involved in now, was that we accepted Donovan and Casey and the formulation of the CIA, where certain American citizens were vetted so that they had the right to look at certain parts of the government, and the rest of us weren't. And so we've gone along with an executive who's gotten more and more involved with taking advantage of that situation. And we look at succession of presidents who've accrued power by degrees. Trump just comes in and says, here are the levers of government, I can just pull them, and he does. So we're going to lose the park system, and we're going to have the environment around us degraded, and there's nothing we can do about it. Yeah.
So what are your observations about the Mueller investigation
Uh-huh.
and possibilities for something?
It all comes down to Paul Ryan, who's a spineless, soulless, power-hungry Speaker of the House. Here's what I expect. Total guess. That Mueller will emphasize crimes of obstruction of justice. Right? He'll say that there were, total guess, but there were actions taken by the campaign, actions taken by this one, that one, that were ambiguous, that were probably, you and I might agree, unseemly. Collusion's not a crime. we'd have to come up, you know, he's a criminal investigator, you'd have to come up with some kind of conspiracy to subvert, et cetera, et cetera. But the firing of Comey, the pressure on Sessions, it's all that's obstruction of justice. And Paul Ryan will say, anyone want a tax cut? No congressional support, no nothing. Mueller can't indict Trump. Mueller can't impeach Trump. And Paul Ryan's not going to do anything about anything. I mean, if you come up with, you know, Putin and Trump in a hot tub conspiring to overturn the election, if you've got that evidence, maybe. Short of that, if it's Papadopoulos trying to make a meeting and Donald Trump Jr. being his unsophisticated self, and you know Carter Page doing whatever he's doing, I think, I don't know, but I think none of that is going to lead the congressional majority to do anything, because they like Trump, they don't care, they think this is good governance, and this is what they planned on him doing. So I'm completely in despair about the Mueller thing, because I think Mueller will probably present credible evidence that crimes were committed, but no one's going to arrest anybody. Well, I mean Trump. They may arrest other people. But having said that, paragraph 2, if he's got evidence of money laundering in the 90s, then I want to see it. Because I've always sort of thought that was where it was. But I don't know if he does or not. But if he does, and that leads to indictments against Ivanka and Jared, then we're in a different ballgame. So, I didn't say anything you didn't know already. It gave me a chance to denounce Ryan.
What I find just as scary as everything you've laid out is that who do the Democrats have to put up a good fight against Trump?
Yeah, there's a great line in The Untouchables, and I won't cite it completely because that is an ethnic slur in it. But in the movie The Untouchables, Sean Connery, how could I forget Sean Connery? Sean Connery says, just like a so-and-so to bring a knife to a gunfight. And it's just true that Republicans are better at it. They're better at personality destruction, they're better at mobilizing their constituency and base. They're just better at it. Democrats are not particularly good at vicious hand-to-hand political infighting. And so, you know, you live with it. I mean, I think if the American electoral system survives, and I think it's under considerable stress through voter suppression and gerrymandering, but if the American electoral system survives, there's a pretty good chance that the American electorate could eject Trump from power. A lot of damage will be done between then and now. But there's a whole other topic, actually, but it frustrates me a lot when we talk about Trump supporters, the so-called base. I live in Manlius. My mother-in-law lives in Venice, Florida. That's Trump's base.
Yeah.
The idea that Trump's base is the white working class is ridiculous. Trump's base is my neighbors in Manlius and the thousands of retired people in Venice, Florida. They love him. And they love him for reasons that you can guess. Yeah?
So there's obviously, oh, sorry,
Okay.
go ahead.
Back to the co-equal branches of government, the legislative and the executive. A very, very sick John McCain, in a very forceful speech, reminded his colleagues that they were co-equals, did not go anywhere.
Yeah, right. Because they don't act like one. But they, you know, this is a long-standing thing that I remember someone asking that, and it's not a particularly funny joke, but what was Millard Fillmore's legislative agenda? He didn't have one. You know, he was going to run the post office. But now you have congressional majorities that look to the president to set the national agenda. And for my money, I don't want that. I like disorganized legislative chaos.
So there's obviously a lot of reason for deep-seated anxiety and concern, but where do you see the opportunities for hope? Or do you see?
Well, that's a personal question, so I'll answer it in personal terms. I am a very hopeful person. I believe in the ultimate redemption of the human family. I mean, I don't think that the system and the country can be completely taken over in one fell swoop, a bite. I do think we've been on a very negative trajectory for a long time. But I thought it was up when I walked in. You know, the Women's March, which of course the national media pretended didn't happen, is very hopeful. The idea, the numbers of people under 27 who oppose Trump is very helpful. The idea that global poverty is at its lowest point in a long, long time is hopeful. The murder rate in New York City is lower than it's ever been, and stop and frisk is down 97%, right? So, you know, thank you. I'm just a hopeful person.
And Time Magazine too, the Avengers, the issue devoted to women who are running, who had never run before.
Yeah.
That was a great cover story last week.
Yeah, I just hope that the kind of energy that's represented in your group and many others continues. Because the midterm election is going to be a lot harder than people think. It's very hard to take over the Senate, very hard. I wouldn't expect it to happen. And the idea that the House is going to flip, we'll see. There are some hopeful signs. Pennsylvania's going to change their lines, you know. But I don't know. Yeah.
How much of Trump's ascension is related to the economic problems, problems in the economic system?
Yeah.
And how much of it do you think his decline will be depending on that? I'm not as hopeful as you are about the economic situation in the world.
Yeah, well, I didn't say it was, well, I mean, I included that in my things of hope, but I mean, global poverty is in fact down. We've added millions and millions and millions of people out of poverty in the last 20 years, but I'm not going to argue that with you. But here's an interesting thing. Trump's approval rating, excuse me, is, what is it, like 37%? Yeah. And unemployment is 4%. Yeah. That's shocking. That means that there's a strong core of Americans who just don't like this guy. They don't trust him. And it doesn't really matter now, the macroeconomic circumstances. I find it, well, it's not surprising because he's what he is. But presidents who claim success because of the stock market are just setting themselves up, right? I mean, you know, this is why to go back in history a little bit, if Al Gore had asked me in 2000 what he should do, I would say, do not run for president, because the business cycle has not been repealed. This sort of, people thought that this was just going to go on forever. Of course it's not. The stock market is going to plummet. There will be a recession. And if Trump is president and he's at 37% at 4% unemployment, then what happens to his support in Manlius in Florida? It softens, they don't vote, and he gets kicked out of office. But I don't want to call for that, right? Because I'm an upstanding, patriotic, good-thinking person. The Mitch McConnells of the world want recession when Democrats are in power, right? It's like the DACA question, right? There's a heartless person, a Paul Ryan, if it was in his interest, would say, let him deport them. It'll be so unpopular that we'll win. But we can't say that because we have hearts. So the economic performance at the moment, 4% unemployment, is a remarkably low number, and yet he is the most unpopular president in his first year ever. So one could say that if the stock market went down, that probably wouldn't matter that much. But he couldn't say it anymore. Well, he'd say it anyway. But if unemployment went to 6.5%, 7%, and economic growth was, 1% or a recession, he's toast. Absolute toast. Because then all he's left with is racism. And racism gets you about 30% of the vote, it looks like. And so now he has racism and Manlius and Venice. Not that there isn't racism in Manlius and Venice, but Manlius and Venice are at least a little embarrassed about it. So right now he's got racism and Venice and Manlius. But if all he's got is racism, I don't think he can win. That's the Sarah Palin vote. And that doesn't get you elected president. Yeah,
He's going to testify under oath soon.
you think?
What's the chance?
I don't think.
What's the chance of him telling the truth under oath?
Well, Tim O'Brien, if you don't read Tim O'Brien of Bloomberg News, is a fabulous person to follow on Twitter and to read Bloomberg News. Tim O'Brien wrote a book about Trump, and he claimed that Trump wasn't as rich as Trump said he was. So Trump did what Trump does, he sued him. And that meant that Trump had to be deposed in discovery. And Tim O'Brien said that he lied, he had to admit to 30 lies in 2 days of testimony. Because his lawyers told him, this is a different story, Donald, right? This isn't Fortune magazine, this isn't Fortune magazine. This is perjury. So when they ask you how much the apartment was worth, you can't say 2 million when it's sold for 400,000, right? So he admitted 30 lies under oath. And Tim O'Brien, just this morning, wrote a very interesting article in Bloomberg News saying, you put someone like this under oath and the lawyer warns him of the consequences of perjury, all bets are off, okay? But I don't think he'll do it.
No.
This is one of the things that really surprised me, not surprised me, but chagrined me, is that a verb? When the New York Times said yesterday, Trump ends speculation by agreeing to testify under oath. When does Trump ever end anything? That was then. This is now. Tomorrow's tomorrow. Next week's next week. The idea that President Trump would say, I'm going to testify under oath, and that means that he'll testify under oath, is laughable. He might, but he might not. So I have no idea what he's going to do. I know that his lawyers are very concerned about it, because he will have difficulty, I'm sure, maintaining a consistent story. But I don't know. You know, it reminds me of the Bill Clinton deposition, right? You know? And there was a guy who was really good at it. As my man Jerry Brown said, a particularly talented liar. And you watch that deposition and you see Bill Clinton and you see the engines turning. And he's thinking, oh boy, someone knows about Monica. And then he tries to work his way through it. Trump's a different kind of cat. It's not how he operates. But Tim O'Brien is a very important person because he watched him testify under oath. And under oath, under advice of attorney, he told the truth. Yes.
Maybe one more question.
Okay.
Donald Trump is particularly narcissistic, particularly insidious. But if one of the other Republican candidates become president, would we find ourselves in a substantially different place?
I think
in terms of policy, governance, the judiciary?
Right. No, that's what I said. I don't know if you heard in the beginning. I think there are two things. On policy, etc., he's a Republican, right? And the Electoral College allowed him to win, just as it allowed George Bush to win, and this is what you get. And I'm not surprised. I'm chagrined, but I'm not surprised. I think on the autocratic notions, I think there would be great differences, yes. Because he's a shameless human being, utterly shameless. And I do think that there would be differences. I had a discussion, for example, about if Mike Pence became president. And I think that would be an absolutely horrible thing. I'm not going to use the words I would use to describe Mike Pence in private. But Mike Pence is dangerous. I don't think he's fundamentally autocratic. He's theocratic, which makes him extremely dangerous. Good, it's on film. He's dangerous. But he's dangerous in an American theocratic sense. He's not dangerous in I'm going to overthrow the democratic state sense. And I actually think Trump is that dangerous.
Thank you.